I had always dreamed of a quiet life after the military. 20 years of service, 14 deployments, and enough classified missions to fill a library of redacted documents. I wanted nothing more than to wake up without the sound of explosions, to sleep without a weapon beside my bed. The little two-bedroom house on Maple Street seemed perfect. A modest property with a large oak tree providing shade in the front yard, neighbors who waved but did not pry, and enough distance from the city to hear crickets at night instead of sirens. The moving truck had barely pulled away when Mrs. Henderson from next door brought over a chocolate cake and a pamphlet. "Welcome to Oak Haven," she said with a tight smile. "You will want to familiarize yourself with the Homeowners Association guidelines. Craig runs a tight ship around here." I thanked her, set the cake aside, and tossed the pamphlet onto my kitchen counter without a second glance. I had spent years following orders and protocols. Surely civilian life would be simpler. I settled into a routine. Morning runs, afternoon gardening, evenings on the porch watching the sunset. I planted flowers, repainted the shutters, and even splurged on a cheerful garden gnome that reminded me of my grandfather. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough, though I noticed they always glanced around before stopping to chat, as if worried about being seen speaking to me. The first violation notice arrived exactly 3 weeks after I moved in. It was printed on expensive letterhead with an official-looking seal. Unapproved lawn ornament section 14, paragraph 3. The notice demanded I remove my garden gnome within 48 hours or face a $100 fine. I laughed, thinking it must be a joke. A fine for a garden gnome. But when I called the number listed, a stern voice confirmed it was very real. "All exterior decorations must be approved by the HOA board," the woman explained without warmth. "The form takes 4 to 6 weeks to process." I removed the gnome that afternoon, not wanting to cause trouble. It was just a ceramic figurine, after all, not worth fighting over. 3 days later, another notice arrived. Incorrect mailbox paint shade, section 8, paragraph 12. This time, the fine was $150. I inspected my mailbox, a perfectly normal black metal box that came with the house. According to the notice, the shade of black was midnight when it should have been onyx. I did not even know there were different shades of black paint. Nevertheless, I repainted the mailbox the next day. 1 week later, another notice. Flagpole height violation, section 22, paragraph 7. My modest American flag, which I had hung with pride, was apparently 2 inches too high. The fine was $200. I adjusted the flagpole height, measuring it 3 times to ensure compliance. The notices kept coming. My grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. My garbage bins were visible from the street for 15 minutes too long after collection. My front door wreath contained unapproved seasonal foliage. Each violation carried a higher fine than the last. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. How could anyone live under such scrutiny? I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting to address these concerns directly. The meeting was held in Craig Phillips' oversized living room. He was a man in his 50s with expensive clothes and the smug expression of someone who had never been told no. When I entered, the room fell silent. 8 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I recognized several of my neighbors, though none would meet my gaze. "You must be the new resident of 1422 Maple," Craig said, not bothering to stand. "We were just discussing your property, actually." His voice carried the artificial politeness of a man who enjoyed wielding power. "You have quite the collection of violations for someone who has only been here a month." "That is what I came to discuss," I said calmly. "These violations seem excessive. I am trying to comply, but—" Craig cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Rules are rules. This neighborhood has standards. If you cannot maintain them, perhaps this is not the community for you." The room remained silent. Not a single person spoke in my defense. I maintained my composure, though I could feel my jaw tightening. "I have followed every instruction. I removed the gnome. I repainted the mailbox. I adjusted the flagpole. What exactly am I doing wrong?" Craig leaned forward, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You know what they say about military types, too used to following orders to understand the subtleties of civilian life." He glanced around the room, encouraging snickers from his sycophants. "This is not a barracks. This is a refined neighborhood. Perhaps you should consider if you fit in here." I understood then. This was not about rules. This was about me. For whatever reason, Craig had decided I did not belong, and he was using the HOA as his weapon. As I walked home that evening, I realized I was not just dealing with petty bureaucracy. I was being targeted. And for the first time since moving to Oak Haven, I felt the familiar tension in my shoulders that had accompanied me through war zones. Someone had declared war on me in my own home. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. 2 weeks after my unsuccessful meeting with Craig, I received an invitation to the quarterly HOA General Assembly. All residents were strongly encouraged to attend. The passive-aggressive wording suggested that absence would be noted and perhaps penalized. I had received 4 more violation notices since the last meeting, including one for excessive water usage during non-designated hours, when I had been watering my dying rose bush. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile building with uncomfortable chairs arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform. I arrived early and chose a seat near the back, observing as my neighbors filed in. They moved like cautious animals, eyes darting around, shoulders hunched. No one spoke above a whisper. When Craig entered with his board members, the room fell completely silent. Craig took his position at the center of the platform, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized his right-hand man, Walter, a retired accountant with cold eyes and a permanent frown. Beside him sat Patricia, a woman who wore her blonde hair in a tight bun and clutched her designer purse like a weapon. The other 2 board members were younger, ambitious-looking professionals who appeared to hang on Craig's every word. "Let us begin," Craig announced without preamble. "First item, delinquent dues and fines." He gestured to Walter, who opened a leather-bound ledger. "Sandra Miller, 1567 Birch Avenue. 3 months behind on dues plus accumulated fines, totaling $1,450. A young woman in the front row stood up, clutching a toddler to her chest. Her face was flushed with embarrassment. "I have been trying to catch up," she said, her voice trembling. "Since my husband left, it has been difficult. I sent in half the amount last week. If I could just have a payment plan for the rest." Craig cut her off. "The bylaws are clear. Payment plans are not permitted for delinquent accounts exceeding 60 days. The board has voted to place a lien on your property effective immediately." The woman gasped, "But I could lose my house, my children." "You should have thought about your children before ignoring your obligations to this community," Patricia interjected, her voice dripping with false concern. "Actions have consequences, dear." The young mother sat down, tears streaming silently down her face as she hugged her child closer. Not a single person in the room came to her defense. They all stared straight ahead, as if afraid to witness her humiliation. Walter continued down his list of delinquents, each case handled with the same cold efficiency. Then came an item that made my blood boil. Harold Jenkins, 1608 Elm Street, unapproved exterior modification. An elderly man stood up slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. I recognized him immediately from his Vietnam veteran cap. "The modification in question is my wheelchair ramp," he said, his voice weathered but dignified. "I had it installed last month after my hip replacement. My doctor provided documentation." "Which was submitted 3 days after installation," Craig interrupted. "The bylaws require pre-approval of all exterior modifications, no exceptions." "I could not climb my own steps," Mr. Jenkins explained. "I was in the hospital longer than expected. My son had the ramp built so I could come home." "Rules exist for a reason," Patricia said. "What if everyone just built whatever they wanted without approval? It would be chaos." Mr. Jenkins stood his ground. "I fought for this country. I have owned this home for 40 years. Surely there can be some accommodation for medical necessity." Craig's expression hardened. "The board has voted. The ramp must be removed within 7 days or fines will begin at $100 per day." Something snapped inside me. I stood up. "That ramp is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act," I said clearly. "Federal law supersedes HOA bylaws." The room turned to stare at me. Craig's face darkened. "We do not recognize your right to speak at this time." "I am a homeowner and community member," I replied calmly. "And I am pointing out that you are attempting to enforce a regulation that violates federal law." Craig leaned forward. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Johnson?" "No, but I can read, and I suspect the local housing authority would be very interested in this conversation." A murmur spread through the room. Craig banged his gavel. "You are out of order. One more outburst and you will be removed." He turned to Mr. Jenkins. "The board's decision stands. This meeting is not a debate forum." Mr. Jenkins sat down heavily, defeat evident in his shoulders. I remained standing. "This is wrong," I said, "and everyone in this room knows it." Craig's eyes narrowed. "Security, please escort Mr. Johnson out." A large man approached me. He did not wear a uniform, just an earpiece and a black polo shirt with the HOA logo. I did not resist, but as I walked toward the exit, I noticed something on the security guard's forearm partially visible beneath his sleeve, a tattoo of a stylized animal claw. He caught me looking and quickly pulled his sleeve down. At the door, Craig called out to me. "Mr. Johnson, a word of advice. This community has thrived for 20 years under my leadership. People who do not adjust to our standards do not last long here. I would recommend you watch yourself very carefully." As I walked home under the setting sun, I could not shake the image of that young mother's tears or Mr. Jenkins' defeated expression. Something was deeply wrong in Oak Haven, and it went beyond petty power trips. I began to wonder if there was more to Craig's reign than simple neighborhood tyranny. That night I unpacked a box I had hoped would remain sealed, my old military equipment. I set up surveillance cameras around my property, carefully concealed in birdhouses and garden fixtures. I began recording every interaction with HOA members. I photographed every violation notice. I started a detailed log of dates, times, and incidents. My neighbors noticed my activities but kept their distance. One evening, Mrs. Henderson hurried over while I was checking my mailbox. "You should be careful," she whispered, looking around nervously. "Craig has connections, bad ones." "What kind of connections?" I asked. She glanced toward Craig's house further down the street. "There is a reason no one speaks up. Last year, a family tried to fight the HOA over assessment fees. Their car windows were smashed. Their dog disappeared. They moved out within a month." She lowered her voice further. "Craig has friends in the Maulers." "The Maulers?" "A motorcycle club, but not the charity-run type. These are bad people. They do Craig's dirty work when his legal bullying does not work." She squeezed my arm. "Just pay the fines, keep your head down. It is not worth it." Before I could ask more questions, she hurried away. That night I researched the Maulers. They were indeed a motorcycle club with chapters in several states, known for drug trafficking and intimidation. What caught my attention was their logo, a stylized claw mark, the same tattoo I had seen on the security guard at the meeting. As I dug deeper, I discovered something even more disturbing. During my last deployment overseas, my unit had disrupted a weapons smuggling operation. The intelligence had identified the buyers as a U.S.-based criminal organization using motorcycle clubs as fronts. One of the groups mentioned was the Maulers. I sat back in my chair, the pieces clicking into place. Craig was not just a neighborhood tyrant. He was connected to organized crime, and somehow my quiet retirement had placed me directly in his territory. The question was, did they know who I was, what I had done, or was I simply their next convenient target? The first direct threat came on a Tuesday morning. I stepped out to retrieve my newspaper and found my white picket fence defaced with red spray paint. "Pay or suffer" was scrawled across the panels in dripping letters. I took photographs before cleaning it off, adding the images to my growing file of evidence. That evening, I returned from grocery shopping to find all 4 of my car tires slashed. The security cameras I had installed 2 days earlier had been ripped from their mounts, their wires dangling uselessly. A note was tucked under my windshield wiper. CAMERAS equals CONSEQUENCES. I called the local police, but their response was lackluster at best. The officer who arrived seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned Craig and the HOA. "Listen, sir," he said quietly. "I cannot officially say anything, but some people in this town have connections. If this is about HOA disputes, I would recommend you work it out through proper channels." "Is that what you told the family whose dog disappeared?" I asked. The officer's face paled. I do not know what you are talking about. I will file a vandalism report, but do not expect much. He left quickly after that, and I had the distinct impression my report would be buried. 3 nights later at exactly 11:00 p.m., a motorcycle pulled up across from my house. The rider, a large man in a leather vest, simply sat there, revving his engine at random intervals. The noise was deafening in the quiet neighborhood, yet no lights came on in surrounding houses. No one called to complain. The message was clear: no one would help me. After an hour of this psychological warfare, I decided to confront him. I walked calmly across the street, stopping a safe distance from the bike. The rider watched me through his visor, engine still rumbling. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The rider cut his engine and removed his helmet. He was a bear of a man with a shaved head and a beard streaked with gray. "Just enjoying the night air," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Free country, right? Seems like an unusual spot to park." He shrugged. "I go where I want when I want." He extended his arm to adjust his mirror, and that is when I saw it. Not just the claw tattoo of the Maulers, but another mark beneath it. A distinctive emblem of a scorpion inside a diamond. I had seen that exact tattoo before in a village halfway around the world on the arm of a gunrunner who had been selling American weapons to insurgents. I kept my face neutral, but my mind raced. This was not a coincidence. The Maulers were not just local thugs. They were part of an international network I had helped disrupt years ago. But did they know who I was? Or was Craig simply using them as muscle against another HOA victim? The biker seemed to be studying my reaction. "Nice neighborhood," he said. "Shame if anything happened to disturb the peace." He started his engine again. "Sleep tight, soldier." He emphasized the last word, then roared away down the street. He knew, somehow they knew who I was. My military background was no secret. My service was mentioned in the local paper when I first moved in. But the specific connection to their overseas operations, that was classified information. Either they had access to intelligence leaks, or they were simply making educated guesses to intimidate me. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I pulled up floorboards in my bedroom closet and retrieved a locked case I had hoped would remain untouched. Inside were items from my former life, equipment, credentials, and resources that normal retirees do not possess. I had not been just any soldier. My operations had been specialized, deniable, and highly effective, and now those skills would serve a new purpose. By dawn, I had implemented a new security protocol. I moved my valuable documents off-site, hidden in a storage locker rented under a different name. I configured a series of burner phones and prepaid credit cards. I installed new, better concealed cameras around my property. And most importantly, I prepared my home for potential visitors, not with weapons, but with surveillance and non-lethal countermeasures. I also made it appear that I was spooked. I ostentatiously packed bags into my car, drove to a hotel 30 miles away, and checked in under my real name. I made sure to be seen by the front desk and security cameras. Then I sneaked out through a service entrance, took a series of buses and ride-shares back to Oak Haven, and re-entered my home through a cellar access point I had modified for exactly this purpose. Let them think I had fled. Let them think they had won. The truth was, I had never been more present, more vigilant, or more dangerous than I was right now. Craig and his maulers had made a critical error. They had threatened a man who had spent his entire career neutralizing threats, and now the hunter was about to become the hunted. The neighborhood transformed overnight. With me supposedly gone, the maulers became bolder. They patrolled the streets on their motorcycles, deliberately intimidating residents. Mrs. Henderson's flower beds were destroyed. Mr. Jenkins' wheelchair ramp was dismantled while he was at a doctor's appointment. Sandra Miller, the single mother who had fallen behind on HOA dues, found her car windows smashed. I watched it all from the shadows of my home, documenting everything with long-range cameras and directional microphones. The maulers were not just Craig's thugs. They were becoming his enforcers in a neighborhood protection racket disguised as an HOA. On the third night of my supposed absence, I witnessed Craig meeting with 3 maulers in his garage. They exchanged envelopes and spoke in hushed tones. I could not hear the details, but their body language suggested a business transaction rather than intimidation. Craig was not a victim of the maulers. He was a partner. The following morning, Mrs. Henderson's shed mysteriously caught fire. The fire department ruled it an accident, but I had captured footage of a mauler flicking a cigarette into a pile of oily rags near the structure just before dawn. The message to the neighborhood was clear: cross Craig and accidents happen. That night, I began my counteroffensive. I moved through backyards and side streets, placing hidden cameras in strategic locations throughout the neighborhood. I left subtle signs of my continued presence. A garden light turned on in my supposedly empty house. A curtain slightly moved, just enough to make them wonder. I also began making covert contact with neighbors I identified as potential allies. Mr. Jenkins was the first. I waited until he was alone in his backyard, then approached quietly from the adjoining property. "Do not turn around," I said softly. "Keep gardening as if nothing is happening." To his credit, the old veteran did not miss a beat. He continued pruning his rose bush. "Thought you skipped town." "That is what they are supposed to think. I need information." "Been wondering when you would fight back," he said, a smile in his voice though I could not see his face. "What do you need to know?" "Everything about Craig, his schedule, his visitors, his finances." Mr. Jenkins nodded slightly. "He owns 6 properties in the neighborhood, collects rent but claims they are vacant on tax forms. The maulers use one as a drop house. Police know but look the other way." "Why?" "Chief Wilson's brother-in-law is on Craig's payroll. Works as a security consultant, but has not had a real job in years." I made mental notes. How long has this been going on? 5 years, started small, just bullying and fines, grew into something worse after Craig met the bikers at a fundraiser. Now he controls the whole neighborhood through fear. Tried to sell my house last year. Realtor suddenly backed out. No explanation. "I need proof, documents, recordings, anything showing the connection between Craig and the maulers." Mr. Jenkins hesitated. "Patricia, his right hand on the board, she keeps records of everything, says it is for insurance. Heard her fighting with Craig about it last month. She lives at 1723 Oak Drive." "Thank you, stay safe, do not take risks." "Too old to be afraid," he replied. "Did not fight for this country to live under a tyrant in my own neighborhood." Over the next week, I gathered intelligence from other sympathetic neighbors. Each had a piece of the puzzle. The retired teacher who had witnessed Craig accepting cash from a mauler behind the community center. The teenage kid who delivered groceries to Craig's vacant rental properties and saw motorcycle parts and drug paraphernalia. The accountant who had been pressured to falsify HOA financial records. I compiled everything in secure digital files, backed up to encrypted cloud storage. I leaked anonymous tips to local reporters about financial irregularities in the HOA. I filed anonymous complaints with state housing authorities about ADA violations. I was setting up the dominoes, preparing for them to fall at precisely the right moment. But Craig sensed something was wrong. The maulers increased their patrols. 2 men in a black SUV parked outside my empty house for hours at a time. They searched my property while I watched from my hidden observation post in the attic. They found nothing. I had become a ghost in my own home. My most valuable intelligence came from Patricia. After 2 weeks of surveillance, I identified her routine. Every Thursday, she visited a storage facility on the edge of town. I followed her discreetly and observed her accessing a climate-controlled unit. That night, I made my move. Getting into the storage facility was trivial for someone with my training. Finding the right unit took patience. Accessing it without leaving evidence required skill. But inside, I found exactly what I needed: copies of every HOA document for the past 5 years, including dual sets of financial records. One set for official purposes, another showing the actual money flow. Craig had been embezzling funds, laundering money for the maulers, and using HOA resources to run their operation. I photographed everything, then left the unit exactly as I had found it. The next day, I made an anonymous call to the FBI's public corruption hotline. I did not identify myself or provide evidence yet. I merely planted the seed. The authorities would need to be ready when I finally sprung my trap. The breaking point came when Sandra Miller was evicted from her home. I watched from across the street as she and her children loaded their belongings into a small rental truck, tears streaming down their faces. Craig stood on his porch down the street, watching with satisfaction. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who cannot pay. That night, a mauler broke into my supposedly empty house. He was searching for something specific, looking through my files, checking my computer. I allowed him to think the house was empty, tracking his movements through my hidden cameras. When he finally left, I followed him to a meeting with Craig behind the community center. "He is gone," the mauler reported. "No sign of any evidence or recordings." "Are you sure?" Craig demanded. He seemed like the type to keep records. "Place is clean. Either he ran scared or he has nothing on us." Craig seemed relieved. "Good, we will foreclose on his property next month, add it to our portfolio." That was when I knew the time for reconnaissance was over. Craig had declared total war. Now it was time to strike back. The maulers discovered my deception on a rainy Tuesday night. One of their prospects, a young member looking to prove himself, noticed a light in my supposedly vacant house. Rather than reporting it, he decided to investigate himself, hoping to impress the senior members. His mistake. I was prepared for visitors. I had transformed my modest home into a controlled environment where I maintained every advantage. Motion sensors alerted me the moment someone tested my back door. I watched on my monitors as the young mauler picked the lock, surprisingly skillful for a street thug, and entered my kitchen. I could have confronted him immediately, but patience had always been my greatest tactical asset. I watched as he explored the house, growing increasingly confused by the lack of dust in a supposedly abandoned property. When he discovered the functioning security cameras in my office, he panicked and called for backup. Within 30 minutes, 3 more maulers arrived, led by the bear-like man with the scorpion tattoo I had confronted earlier. They moved through my house with the confidence of predators, unaware that they were already caught in my web. I had prepared non-lethal countermeasures throughout the property, not to injure seriously, but to disable and disorient. The first trap was triggered in the hallway, a simple tripwire connected to a series of flashbangs designed to temporarily blind and disorient rather than harm. The explosion of light and sound sent 2 of the maulers stumbling backward, cursing and clutching their eyes. The leader recovered quickly, shouting orders to continue the search. As they moved toward my bedroom, I activated the second countermeasure. Industrial-grade pepper spray dispersed through the ventilation system. The effect was immediate. 3 of the intruders fell to their knees, coughing and retching. Only the leader remained standing, pulling a bandana over his face. "He is still here," the leader shouted through his makeshift mask. "Find him!" He drew a pistol from his waistband, escalating the situation beyond what I had anticipated. I had avoided direct confrontation until now, but the introduction of a firearm changed the equation. I moved silently through the concealed passage I had built between the walls, emerging behind the leader as he entered my study. Before he could react, I disarmed him with a precision strike to his wrist, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. He was strong, military trained, judging by his stance, but I had surprise and preparation on my side. We struggled briefly before I locked him in a chokehold. "Tell your men to retreat," I whispered in his ear, "or this gets much worse." The leader hesitated, then shouted to his companions, "Fall back, everyone out." I released him with a shove toward the door. "This is your only warning," I said calmly. "Do not come back." As the maulers stumbled out of my house, one of them fell hard on the porch steps, his leg twisting unnaturally beneath him. His scream of pain echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The others dragged him to their motorcycles and fled, leaving their injured comrade behind. I approached the fallen mauler cautiously. He was young, barely 20, with a fresh tattoo on his neck. His leg was clearly broken, the bone visible beneath torn jeans. "Please," he whimpered, "do not kill me." "I am not going to hurt you," I assured him, applying a pressure bandage from my medical kit. "But you need to answer some questions. Who sent you here? What were you looking for?" Craig pays us, he gasped through pain. Said you were dangerous, said you had evidence that could destroy everything. What evidence did he think I had? Financial records, something about offshore accounts and property fraud. He is scared of you, man. I called an ambulance anonymously, then disappeared back into my house before emergency services arrived. 20 minutes later, Craig's Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of my property. He surveyed the scene, paramedics loading the injured mauler into an ambulance, neighbors watching from windows, police taking statements. Craig appeared unnerved, his usual composure cracking. He kept looking around, perhaps expecting to see me watching. He was right to be paranoid. I was observing from my hidden position, capturing his every movement on camera. As Craig spoke with the officers, a black SUV pulled up. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, Gordon Wilson, the police chief's brother-in-law and Craig's connection to local law enforcement. They conversed intensely, Gordon repeatedly pointing at my house and making threatening gestures. Whatever plan they were formulating, it was clear they were escalating rather than retreating. That night, Craig called an emergency HOA meeting. I infiltrated the community center through a service entrance and listened from the ceiling crawl space above the meeting room. Craig was unhinged, his voice trembling with rage as he addressed the board. "Johnson is still here," he snarled. "He attacked our security team when they were performing a routine inspection of his abandoned property." "Security team?" Patricia questioned. "You mean the Maulers? Craig, this has gone too far. We agreed to use them for intimidation, not armed home invasions." "They were not armed," Craig lied. "Johnson is the dangerous one. He has military training. He is collecting evidence against us." "Against you," Patricia corrected. "Some of us never agreed to the money laundering or the property scheme." "You took your cut," Craig snapped. "We are all involved now." He paced the room. "We need to end this tonight. The Maulers are ready for a final solution." The room fell silent. Walter finally spoke up. "What exactly are you suggesting, Craig?" "An accident, a faulty gas line, a tragic fire, these things happen." The implications hung in the air. Craig was not just suggesting intimidation anymore. He was planning murder. I had expected escalation, but not this level of desperation. Whatever evidence he thought I possessed must be more damaging than I had realized. I needed to accelerate my timeline. As the meeting broke up, I slipped away and made my final preparations. I had planned to gather more evidence before confronting Craig directly, but circumstances had forced my hand. It was time to end this. The next morning, I waited until Craig left his house, then approached him as he retrieved his newspaper. He froze when he saw me, his face draining of color. "Good morning, Craig," I said pleasantly. "Lovely day for a neighborhood chat." He stammered. "You are supposed to be gone." "I did not realize there was a schedule for my departure," I replied. "I rather like it here, think I will stay indefinitely." Craig glanced around, perhaps hopping to see his Mauler protectors. "What do you want?" "I want to live in peace," I said. "But you seem determined to make that impossible, so let me be clear, I know everything. The embezzlement, the money laundering, the property fraud, the connections to the Mauler's international operations, all of it." Craig's expression hardened. "You know nothing, and if you did, you would be smart enough to keep quiet about it." "That is where you are wrong," I said. "I have already shared what I know with people who will release it if anything happens to me. Federal agencies, journalists, lawyers." Craig stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. The Maulers are not just some local gang. They have connections everywhere. Government, military, they can make people disappear." "I am well aware of their reach," I replied calmly. "We have met before, though they might not remember me. Kandahar Province, 2017. I was part of the team that intercepted their weapons shipment. 5 million in cash, 24 crates of military-grade hardware. They lost some good men that day." Craig's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You were." "Yes," I interrupted, "and I am much better at this than they are. So here is what happens next. You call off your dogs. You resign from the HOA. You stop harassing my neighbors. And maybe, just maybe, I do not send everything I have to the FBI. You are bluffing, Craig said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Try me, I replied. I have nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, have everything to lose. I turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Craig, if anyone else enters my property uninvited, I will not be as merciful as I was last night. That is a promise. As I walked away, I could feel Craig's eyes burning into my back. I had thrown down the gauntlet. The next move was his, and I was ready for whatever came next. The event was to be held in the Central Park area of the neighborhood, and Craig had spared no expense. Catering tents were erected. A bouncy castle appeared for the children. A live band was setting up on a portable stage. It all looked festive and normal, but I recognized it for what it was, a trap. Craig was drawing me out into the open, surrounded by witnesses and potential collateral damage. If I did not attend, I would violate the mandatory attendance requirement, giving him another excuse to levy fines or take action against my property. If I did attend, I would be exposed and vulnerable. It was a calculated move designed to force my hand. I spent the day before the event finalizing my countermeasures. I contacted a journalist from the city newspaper who had been investigating corruption in suburban developments. I reached out to an old military contact, now working with the FBI's Organized Crime Division. I compiled my evidence into multiple packages, ready for distribution. And finally, I prepared myself mentally for direct confrontation. The day of the community appreciation event dawned bright and clear. I dressed casually but carefully, clothes that would allow freedom of movement if needed, with multiple pockets for the thumb drives containing my evidence. I also wore a concealed recording device, synced to an off-site server that would stream and save everything automatically. As I approached the park, the scene appeared normal. Families milled about, children played, and neighbors chatted awkwardly over plastic cups of punch. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, tension hummed. The maulers were present, dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakable with their hard eyes and vigilant postures. They were stationed at strategic points around the perimeter, watching everyone. Craig stood at the center of it all, playing the generous host. He wore an expensive polo shirt and a practiced smile, but his eyes constantly scanned the crowd. When he spotted me, his expression flickered briefly before he reassumed his mask of cordiality. "Mr. Johnson," he called out loudly, approaching me with an extended hand. "So glad you could join us. I was beginning to think you had abandoned your property." I shook his hand firmly. I would not miss it, mandatory attendance after all. "Indeed," his smile tightened. "Rules are the foundation of a functioning community, are they not?" "Some rules," I agreed, though I have always believed justice matters more than rules. Craig's eyes narrowed slightly. "Philosophical differences aside, please enjoy yourself. There is plenty of food. Perhaps you would like to address the community later. Tell everyone about your military experiences." The threat was thinly veiled. He was letting me know that he was prepared to expose my past, perhaps with embellishments and lies designed to turn the neighborhood against me. I merely nodded and moved away, circulating through the crowd. I sought out my allies, Mr. Jenkins sitting with his cane beside the refreshment table, Mrs. Henderson nervously arranging flowers, the young mother Sandra Miller, who had been invited back for the event despite her eviction. Each gave me a subtle nod of recognition as I passed. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Craig took the stage. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice amplified through speakers. "Thank you all for coming to this celebration of our wonderful community. Oak Haven has thrived under the careful stewardship of your homeowners association, maintaining property values and quality of life for all residents who abide by our shared standards." The crowd applauded politely. I noticed several people glancing in my direction. "Today is about appreciation," Craig continued. "Appreciating what we have built together and acknowledging those who contribute positively to our community." His gaze fixed on me. "Unfortunately, there are always those who resist order, who challenge the very foundations that keep our neighborhood safe and prosperous." The atmosphere tensed. This was not a celebration, it was a public tribunal. "Mr. Johnson," Craig called out, Perhaps you would like to come up and share your thoughts on community standards. All eyes turned to me. This was Craig's play to isolate and expose me publicly to control the narrative. I had anticipated this moment, prepared for it. But I had also learned through years of covert operations that the best plans are adaptable. I walked calmly to the stage. As I climbed the steps, I noticed two maulers moving to positions behind me. Craig watched with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had maneuvered his opponent into checkmate. I took the microphone. "Thank you, Craig, for the invitation to speak." My voice was steady. "I have only lived in Oak Haven for a short time, but I have learned a great deal about this community." I looked out at the faces watching me, some curious, some hostile, many simply afraid. I have learned that this is a neighborhood of good people who care about their homes, their families, and each other. I have seen acts of kindness between neighbors. I have witnessed courage in the face of intimidation. I paused. I have also witnessed injustice, bullying, and corruption disguised as rule enforcement. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Craig stepped forward as if to take back the microphone, but I held up my hand. "Before anyone interrupts, I want to be clear that I have evidence to support everything I am about to say, evidence that has already been shared with federal authorities and media outlets." I reached into my pocket and activated the signal. In the distance, car engines started. "This community has been systematically exploited by Craig Phillips and his associates," I continued. "HOA funds have been embezzled. Properties have been illegally foreclosed upon. Residents have been intimidated into silence by members of a criminal organization known as the Maulers." Craig lunged for the microphone. "This is slander. Security, remove him immediately." The two Maulers moved toward me, but froze as police sirens became audible in the distance. I held up a flash drive. "This contains financial records showing how Craig has stolen over $300,000 from HOA funds over the past 5 years. It shows how he has used the Maulers to intimidate residents and force property sales. It contains evidence of money laundering, tax fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Craig's face contorted with rage. "You have nothing. This is a desperate attempt to—" The first police cruiser pulled up to the park entrance. Then another, and another. Within moments, the park was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles. FBI agents in tactical vests poured out, moving purposefully toward specific targets, including the disguised maulers throughout the crowd. A news van from the local station arrived simultaneously, cameras already rolling. The reporter I had contacted earlier rushed forward, microphone in hand, cameraman in tow. Craig backed away, looking frantically for an escape route. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "I have friends in the department. This will not stand." An FBI agent approached the stage. "Craig Phillips?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. "I am Agent Morales. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy." As agents handcuffed Craig, chaos erupted. Several maulers attempted to flee, only to be intercepted by officers stationed at all exits. Patricia, Craig's right-hand woman, was escorted to a separate vehicle, looking shell-shocked. Walter collapsed into a chair, head in his hands. I stepped down from the stage as my neighbors stared in disbelief. Mr. Jenkins approached me, leaning heavily on his cane. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked quietly. "Since the day they threatened me," I replied. "No one should live in fear in their own home." Mrs. Henderson hurried over, tears in her eyes. "We never thought anyone would stand up to them, not after what happened to the others." "The others?" She lowered her voice. 2 years ago, a man questioned Craig's authority. His house burned down while he was inside. They ruled it an accident. I nodded grimly. "It stops today." Agent Morales approached me, extending his hand. "Thank you for the intelligence, Mr. Johnson. Your information matched perfectly with an ongoing investigation we have been building. We just needed the final connections you provided." "What happens now?" I asked. "We will be investigating every property transaction, every financial record. Anyone who lost their home through Craig's schemes will have legal recourse. The Maulers' local chapter is being dismantled as we speak. with connections to their interstate operations. As Craig was placed in the back of a police cruiser, he locked eyes with me through the window. His expression was no longer one of smug authority, but of defeated rage. I did not look away. He had brought war to my doorstep, never realizing he was attacking someone who had spent a lifetime winning impossible battles. The reporters swarmed around me, asking for statements. Neighbors approached hesitantly, some apologizing for their silence, others expressing gratitude. The community that had been frozen in fear began to thaw in the warm light of justice. "Will you tell us about your military background?" one reporter pressed. "Craig made allegations about your past." I shook my head. "Today is not about me. It is about a community reclaiming its voice. It is about neighbors standing together against corruption and intimidation." I gestured toward Mr. Jenkins, whose wheelchair ramp would now be rebuilt, toward Sandra Miller, who might now have legal recourse to reclaim her home. These are the stories that matter. As the police and FBI continued their work, processing evidence and taking statements, I quietly withdrew from the crowd. The battle was won, but the aftermath would require a different kind of strength, the courage to rebuild, to trust again, to create something better from the ruins of Craig's reign. The neighborhood would never be the same. But perhaps, I thought as I walked home through streets that suddenly felt lighter, that was exactly what it needed. The weeks following Craig's arrest brought a whirlwind of change to Oak Haven. The HOA board was dissolved by court order pending a complete audit of all financial records. FBI agents conducted interviews with every household, uncovering years of systematic abuse and fraud. The local news ran a 3-part exposé on suburban organized crime, featuring Oak Haven as its centerpiece. Craig, Patricia, and 5 senior maulers remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk and the serious nature of their crimes. Walter cooperated with authorities, providing detailed records in exchange for leniency. The investigation expanded to 3 other neighborhoods where Craig had established similar operations, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of millions in stolen property and funds. For the first month, I kept to myself, watching the community slowly process its collective trauma. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years now stopped to talk on sidewalks. People who had been isolated by fear began to emerge, sharing stories of intimidation and abuse they had endured under Craig's regime. When the initial shock subsided, the residents of Oak Haven called a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting with rigid rules and power plays, but a true gathering of neighbors seeking to rebuild. The meeting was held in Mr. Jenkins' backyard, a symbolic choice that rejected the sterile community center that had been Craig's domain. Nearly everyone attended. Sandra Miller was there with her children, having been temporarily rehoused in the neighborhood while legal proceedings determined her right to reclaim her property. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade cookies. Families who had never spoken to each other sat together on folding chairs under the evening sky. Mr. Jenkins called the meeting to order with a gentle tap of his cane. "For too long, we lived as prisoners in our own homes," he began. "We allowed fear to silence us, to isolate us from each other. Today, we begin again." The discussion that followed was cathartic. People shared their experiences, the arbitrary fines, the threats, the constant anxiety. Some wept as they described how Craig had weaponized their financial vulnerabilities or personal circumstances against them. Others expressed shame at their silence, their failure to stand with neighbors who were being victimized. When my turn came to speak, I kept my words few. "I came here looking for peace," I said simply. "I believe we all want the same thing, to live with dignity in our own homes, to be part of a community that supports rather than oppresses its members. We have that opportunity now." The meeting concluded with a decision to form a new homeowners association, one with transparent financial practices, term limits for board members, and a focus on community support rather than punitive enforcement. Mr. Jenkins was nominated as the interim president, with Sandra Miller as treasurer. The vote was unanimous. As spring turned to summer, Oak Haven transformed. The community organized weekend projects to help neighbors whose properties had suffered under Craig's neglect. Gardens bloomed. Fences were mended. Children played freely in front yards that had once been subject to militant inspection. I rebuilt my front yard, planting native flowers that required minimal watering, an environmental choice that would have earned hefty fines under the old regime. And in the center of it all, I placed my garden gnome, the same one that had triggered Craig's first volley in our private war. One by one, neighbors began to visit. Some brought food, casseroles, pies, bread still warm from the oven. Others came with small gifts or simply to talk. Mr. Jenkins arrived with a hand-carved eagle to add to my garden display. "From one veteran to another," he said with a knowing nod. I never confirmed nor denied my specific military background, but he understood enough. Mrs. Henderson brought chrysanthemums and an apology. "I should have warned you more clearly," she said, her eyes downcast. "I knew what Craig was capable of, but I was too afraid to speak up." "Fear is a powerful weapon," I replied. "Craig knew how to use it. That is not your fault." Sandra Miller came with her children, who presented me with a crayon drawing of my house, complete with the garden gnome prominently featured. "They wanted to thank the man who helped us get our home back," she explained. Legal proceedings had reversed her eviction, and the court had ordered restitution for her losses. The most surprising visitor was Patricia, Craig's former second-in-command, who had received probation in exchange for her testimony. She arrived unannounced one evening, standing awkwardly on my porch. "I came to return this," she said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,200, the exact total of all the fraudulent fines Craig had levied against me. "It will not fix everything, but it is a start." "Why did you stay with him so long?" I asked. "You must have known what he was doing was wrong." She looked away. "It started so gradually. First, it was just bending the rules a little, then breaking them in small ways. By the time I realized how far we had gone, I felt trapped. Craig knew things about me, secrets he threatened to expose." She met my eyes. "It is no excuse. I'm just trying to understand it myself." I accepted her apology, not out of forgiveness, but from recognition that healing required acknowledging the past before moving forward. The community would need to process the betrayal and corruption it had endured, but it would do so together, without the shadow of fear. That summer, Oak Haven held its first community festival, not a mandatory event orchestrated as a show of power, but a genuine celebration. Tables lined the park, laden with potluck dishes from every culture represented in our diverse neighborhood. Children played tag between blankets spread on the grass. Mr. Jenkins, officiating as the new HOA president, kept his remarks brief and humble. "This is what community looks like," he said, gesturing around at the gathered families. "Not rules and fines and threats, but people caring for each other, supporting each other, respecting each other's differences while celebrating what brings us together." As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the park, I found myself sitting slightly apart, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. I had not come to Oak Haven seeking battle. I had wanted only peace after years of conflict. Yet I had been reminded of an essential truth: peace is never simply given. It must be earned, sometimes defended, always nurtured. A child ran up and handed me a sparkler, then dashed away giggling. I lit it and watched the sparks dance against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Around me, my neighbors talked and laughed, no longer looking over their shoulders, no longer afraid in their own community. I did not share my full story with them. They did not need to know the details of my military service or the specific operations that had prepared me to recognize and counter Craig's tactics. They simply knew me as the neighbor who had stood up when standing up was necessary. That was enough. As the festival wound down and families began to head home, Mr. Jenkins approached and lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside me. "You know," he said, staring out at the dispersing crowd, "in war there are soldiers who fight because they love battle, and there are soldiers who fight because they love peace so much they will do whatever it takes to protect it." He glanced at me. "I always preferred serving with the second kind." I nodded, accepting his assessment without comment. We sat in comfortable silence as the last of the lanterns were extinguished. The neighborhood settled into the quiet of a summer night, not the tense silence of fear, but the peaceful quiet of safety. The war was over. The battle for Oak Haven was won, but the most important victory was not the defeat of Craig and his criminal enterprise. It was the rebirth of a community that had found its voice, its courage, and its heart. I walked home under a sky full of stars, past houses where lights glowed warmly in windows and families gathered around dinner tables. My garden gnome stood sentinel by my front step, unmolested and unquestioned. I had found peace at last, not the false peace of submission to tyranny, but the true peace that comes from building something worth protecting. And if trouble ever came again to Oak Haven, I would be ready. Not because I sought conflict, but because I had learned through bitter experience that true peace must sometimes be defended. That is the price of a life lived in freedom. That is the lesson of Oak Haven.